Welcome to everyone. Good evening. My name is Phil Harper, and I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and the Department of English. And it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight my friend and English department colleague, Bryan Waterman. In many respects, for many of us, Bryan needs no introduction because, as I've just indicated, he is one of us, having been a member of the English department faculty at NYU since 2001. On the other hand, though, in addition to being an associate professor of English here on the Square, Bryan has, for the last 3 academic years, been visiting associate professor of literature at NYU Abu Dhabi, where he is also the program head in literature. So there may well be people in this audience who have not yet had the pleasure of intellectual communion with him since he's been away for most of these last 3 years. Those people, and indeed all of us, I can tell you, are in for a treat. Bryan Waterman received his PhD in American Studies from Boston University in 2000, and as I've already said, he joined the NYU faculty the following year. His formal training is in 18th and 19th century American literary and cultural history, and he has taught and written extensively in that broad field, publishing articles in a wide range of prominent journals: American Literary History, Early American Literature, William and Mary Quarterly, and in 2007, issuing the book Republic of Intellect, The Friendly Club of New York City, and the Making of American Literature, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. As the subtitle of that volume suggests, Bryan is also deeply interested in the broad literary and cultural history of New York City, having for many years co-taught with our colleague Cyrus Patel the English department's massively popular lecture course, Writing New York, which covers the full historical sweep from the 18th century to the present. In fact, Bryan and Cyrus are the co-editors of the Cambridge Companion to the Literature of New York, which was released in 2010, and Bryan himself has lectured widely on a variety of 20th century New York City cultural movements with a particular focus on the underground music scene of the 1970s. In fact, the other prime item in his publication record is his 2011 contribution to the highly lauded 33 the Third series published by Continuum on pivotal record albums of the last 30 years or so. Bryan's offering focuses on Marquee Moon, the 1977 debut album by the band Television. Bryan has recently suggested to me that what unites all of his work, whether it's focused on the 18th century or on the 20th, is his interest in clubs. That is, he is interested in how social networks generate art and literature. Thus, his 2007 Republic of Intellect book focused on a signal New York City club of the 1790s, while his book on Marquee Moon comprises an examination of CBGB, the famed downtown rock club in Manhattan, in the 1970s. Invariably, he's interested in places where traditional literary culture meets other arts: painting, music, theater, and so on. These interests are reflected, I suspect, in the 2 books that he is currently working on now, again, pitched in different periods. The one is called Seduction Plots, Story of Sex and Scandal in the Revolutionary Atlantic World, from the disappearance of Elizabeth Whitman to the death of Mary Wollstonecraft. That would be the early part of your area of interest. And the second book project in progress is titled New York in the Age of Warhol, which it seems to me is likely related, at least tangentially, to what you're going to be talking about today. And that general interest in clubs and cultural production also seems to be promised to be touched on in today's lecture, which takes as its focus Andy Warhol's 1976 visit to Tehran to take photos for a portrait of Empress Farah Pahlavi along with other members of the Iranian royal family. Bryan will be considering these Iranian portraits in relation to a number of intersecting historical and cultural contexts that I would suspect we don't often think about together. And this alone suggests that the talk will be a highly engaging one, and I certainly have personally been looking forward to it for weeks. The title of the lecture is Andy Warhol in Tehran, and I hope you will join me in welcoming back to our campus Bryan Waterman.
Wow, it's really so fun to be here. Even though my computer, when I'm looking at the slideshow from my side, is reminding me that it's a little bit after 2 o'clock in the morning in Abu Dhabi. And so I'm trying to keep my feet on the ground in New York, at least for the next hour or so. I'm going to just jump right into this talk in a minute, but it's worth noting, I think, that this is a project that really grew out of my teaching, both in New York and in Abu Dhabi. And so I've been working on it for a little while. It's a standalone piece that I'm going to be seeking publication for in the next year or so. But when I've presented it in other contexts, I've often found that there are people in the audience, the topic by itself draws people out, who have various connections to either Warhol or to the country of Iran. And so in every context I've discussed this material in, I've been pleased to find people who have connections to someone who has connections, someone who has connections. And I end up talking to people that I never imagined I might be able to contact by email, including several of the people I'll talk about. The other half of the people I'll talk about don't return my emails. So if you have personal connections to things that I'm talking about, please don't hesitate to volunteer your services, as I'm still trying to track down a little bit of the story and flesh out some of the details. The genesis of this project came in a class that I started teaching here in 2010, I think. Actually, maybe earlier than that. In the class I started teaching in 2002, the Writing New York class, we had a unit that we affectionately refer to as New York from the Beats to the Punks, and so it started with Allen Ginsberg and ended with Patti Smith. And as I took that material and turned it into a separate course just on the downtown scene in the 60s and 70s, a funny thing happened, which was Andy Warhol, who had been kind of in the background of the material that we lectured on for that class, suddenly became a more prominent organizing force in the things that I was teaching about. And I think some of my students from the course Downtown Scenes are actually here. So those guys had the earliest versions of my thinking about Warhol in that class. And this is really the first long piece that I've written that emerges out of that teaching situation. So it's really great for me to be able to come here and talk about it. When I went to Abu Dhabi 3 years ago, one of the things I was able to do was organize an entire course on Warhol's career, just the 25 years of his artistic career. And in that context, I was really trying to find some way to make Warhol less American, or at least to think about him outside an American context. And I thought, it's kind of funny because Bob Policello's memoir has a lot of stuff about this trip they took to Tehran in 1976, and I thought maybe I'll just focus on that for a day or so in class, and we'll see what comes of it. And it turned out that material, which had just always seemed kind of marginal to me before, really becomes an important explanatory device for Warhol's entire career in the 70s, which I think has been really undervalued. And I think, I was talking to another friend who works a lot on Warhol the other day, and we're all, he and a couple other people I know, are really kind of in agreement that the 70s, which is this dark decade of Warhol's career when people made fun of him for being just a business artist, is way more interesting than has ever been really fully credited. So I hope maybe what I'm talking about tonight will convince you that I think that the 70s is an interesting and fertile, underexplored moment in his career. So I'm going to frame the talk tonight by talking about two recent exhibitions that kind of remind us that Warhol's peculiar relationship with Iran in the 1970s is something worth our consideration. And the first was the show that some of you probably saw at the Asia Society. I think it closed in January of this year. The Iran Modern Show provided Warhol's former staff member at Interview Magazine, Bob Policello, with another occasion to rehearse his account of their trip in 1976 to Iran, during which Warhol was there to snap Polaroids of the Empress Farah Pahlavi, the wife of the Shah, in order to paint her portrait. So the first step in making a Warhol portrait in this period was to take Polaroids of the subject and then later transfer them by screen printing into a painting. So there was a lot of buzz surrounding this show. One of the things that came out of it was that Policello conducted a new interview with the former Empress, who appeared in Interview magazine early this year, and the former Empress herself made an appearance at the show, participated in some public programs there, and sort of seemed to lend a seal of approval almost to this celebration of this moment in which she was intimately involved in the cultivation of an art scene in Tehran prior to the revolution. But the show also noted less spectacular connections between Warhol and pre-revolutionary Iranian art. There was the influence of pop art on some Iranian artists in the 1960s, for instance, or Warhol's decades-long acquaintance with the artist Farah Pahlavi, with whom he had designed advertisements for the department store Bonnet Teller in the 1950s. One of Farah Pahlavi's works on display in the show, the 1975 9-inch diameter mirror ball, was actually on loan from the Warhol Foundation. And he received this piece from Munir during his 1976 trip, which had largely been coordinated by her daughter, Nima, who was a New York-based style writer. She was an assistant to the gossip columnist, Eugenia Shepard, and she was sometimes also a contributor to Interview magazine herself. And Munir apparently swapped this work as a gift. Andy brought one too. He gave her a silk screen of Marilyn Monroe, and he took this one home and kept it on his desk until his death in 1987. The co-curator of Iran Modern argues that Farah Pahlavi's extensive use of mirrors in her work traces to a 1966 visit she made to the shrine of the King of Light in Shiraz, and notes that her creation and use of mirrors and mirror balls on her own account actually invoked children's football games in urban settings. But it's hard for me not to seize on the figure of the mirrored ball as a sort of shared space between Warhol and this Iranian artist in a moment and a set of cultural encounters that we might label Tehran disco. And there's actually a kind of a cool blog that goes by that name that deals with this period in Iran's history. So you might be reminded of the Velvet Underground song, I'll Be Your Mirror, especially imagining it in this context. The other recent reminder of Warhol's mid-70s Iranian moment was the summer 2012 pop art and op art exhibition at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art itself, which featured works by Warhol along with David Hockney, Roy Lichtenstein, Jasper Johns, other late 20th century giants. The museum there has a spectacular collection of 20th century Western art, if you didn't know. The assembly of which was overseen by the former Empress and her cousin, who was the museum's architect and its first director, Kamen Dibba. And that collection's only rarely been viewed and never in full since the decade since the revolution. It's showed periodically, but usually only partially. The Western press periodically describes this collection as gathering dust in the museum's basement, but in reality it's been carefully protected by a series of diligent museum directors, and it's actually been expanded to fill gaps in the original collection, and pieces from that collection occasionally travel outside the country and go on loan to other institutions. So I want to give you an introduction to that collection, just sort of to set the stage, by showing you a rather orientalist and kind of funny in some ways clip that you can find on YouTube. It's the way that the Western media often portrays this collection. And I think it'll just give you a sense of, I think it'll help us set the scene for what I want to talk about.
But the real stars of Tehran are more discreet. They can be found here in the city's Museum of Contemporary Art.
How many of you have seen this clip?
It was built by the Shah in the 1970s. But since then, it displays mostly Iranian artists.
Exceptionally, I've been led into the inner sanctum of the Tehran Contemporary Art Museum. Now, what you have to know is that in 1979, after the Islamic Revolution, many of the paintings have been stored here in this reserve, and these are things that have not been seen since 1979. So it's absolutely incredible, and we are going to be able to see some of them. So let's check it out.
Altogether, 1,500 paintings saved from destruction during the Islamic Revolution. At the time, modern art was considered degenerate, and everything was locked up in this basement, like this Picasso.
So I'd like something American from the 1950s.
Like this Jackson Pollock, for example.
No, I don't like that one. Another one.
Or this complete series of Andy Warhol. I could see the work, but I could not interview any of the staff.
So I would like something with more colors and more graphic.
Ask and you shall receive. Entire walls of Roy Lichtenstein. But also Robert Indiana.
Yeah, but now I'd like something with less color and less graphic.
So here's a mother well. And how about this Monet and Magritte that are just hanging around? Or this Vasarely collection? Around here, there's something for everyone.
Okay, so there's a lot that could be said just about the way that clip is set up. I'm going to just refrain from doing a critique of the clip itself. Okay, this is where we left off. But I want to use this show and also the thought, sort of the distance between this show and the one that was at the Asia Society earlier this year, to think about how to frame three paintings in particular from Warhol's work. And these are the three paintings of Iranian royalty that were completed in between the years of 1976 and 1978 by commission. They were all intended to have been shown in Iran in 1978, but not all of them actually made it there. So the first one to be completed, the one that's in the center here, which is the portrait of Farah Pahlavi. The other two were completed in early 1978. They're the Shah and his twin sister, the Princess Ashraf. These paintings, I want to suggest tonight, demand from us a kind of double vision. Sort of the one eye on our contemporary moment, when interest in the art world in Tehran in the 1970s has revived and has become kind of a topic of discussion in the art world once again, and another eye on the era in which the works were produced and were by many people reviled at the time. So Warhol's critics in New York often read these paintings as signs of his moral bankruptcy, kind of his crass pursuit of financial gain in the 70s, and they just read it as sort of emblematic of everything that was wrong with Warhol in the moment. The critic Robert Hughes, who was an inveterate Warhol hater, assumed that the Iranian interest in Western art was just a ploy to seem liberal and advanced, and considered the conversion, this is his quote, the conversion of the remnants of the American avant-garde into ardent fans of the Pahlavis to be one of the richer social absurdities of the period. And in some ways, you'll start to hear, I think, some precursors to similar attitudes that some people express in terms of commentary on the Gulf art scene today, some resonances between their time and ours, I think, that you'll be able to discern. We can only assume that the Iranian royalties critics within the regime read the paintings as evidence of the Shah's moral bankruptcy in his dealings with the West and of the decadent influence of American culture on his family and the state. And although I'm not going to dismiss any of these explanations entirely, although I'll admit that Robert Hughes really gets on my nerves, I want to argue here for the value of returning to this small subset of Warhol's 1970s portraiture and using it as a window onto the forces at play at the nexus of art, commerce, and politics, especially the politics of oil and the 1970s and maybe in the present. So for those of you who weren't around to experience it firsthand, the 1973-74 oil crisis, in which the Shah played a major role, serves as a useful historical starting point. Responding to the Nixon administration's support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War of '73, OPEC banned petroleum exports to the United States and other allies of Israel and also cut production rates. The Shah opted out of this ban, continuing to produce and export oil through a 5-month standoff, which secured his position as an American ally, if a sort of tenacious one. He enjoyed this favored position in spite of brokering an agreement in December of '73 that helped drive up the price of oil, which further damaged the American economy, but also gave his own country a major income boost, at least through a bubble that lasted for a few years. He overextended, though, probably put more money into development and arms buildup than actually was coming in, especially after Saudi Arabia cut a secret deal with the United States in order to prevent further price increases. Economic troubles within his country, coupled with religious unrest over the liberal program of modernization that he had put into effect in his dealings with the U.S. and Israel, led to the return of his exiled enemy. We grew up, at least I grew up, knowing him as the Ayatollah Khomeini, and forced the departure of the royal family during the revolution of 1979. So that's sort of a closed little historical frame. For those of you who weren't around for it. Those of you who were around for it, of course, there's a lot more that could be said, but I'm just trying to give the basics on there. A side effect of Iran's rapidly growing national wealth was an influx of spending on the arts, which had already seen a decade of development under the twin patronage of oil companies and the Empress. From the moment she married the Shah in 1959, Farah Pahlavi, 20 years the Shah's junior, had made the development of Iran's modern art community, along with the preservation of its past and the importation and display of Western art, a hallmark of her reign. She was sort of cosmopolitan art sensibility that ran through her time in the monarchy. During a highly publicized state visit with her husband to the United States in 1962, she made stops in New York at the Guggenheim and the MoMA. These are the things that the newspapers were all picking up on. The same year, she accompanied the Shah to Paris, where he opened an exhibition of 7,000 years of Iranian art. The Empress's patronage extended to the Tehran biennials, which were established in 1958, just before her wedding, to university arts programs, investment in young artists who she sent to be trained in Paris and the United States, and most controversially to the Shiraz Arts Festival, which brought together Eastern and Western artists and musicians for the years 1967 to 77, including people like John Cage and Merce Cunningham, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Peter Brook, Martha Graham, Alvin Ailey, and dozens of others, along with their counterparts from countries across the globe. In 1972, for instance, Robert Wilson staged his 168-hour piece, Calm Mountain, which included a company of 700 collaborators. In 1977, the Empress, with advice from her cousin, Kamran Dibra, oversaw the founding of the Museum of Contemporary Art, which brought dozens of major dealers in New York and Paris knocking at the palace doors and hopefully peddling their clients' work. So there's sort of a moment in the New York art world where the cultivation of this collection in Tehran seemed to be a goose laying golden eggs. And a lot of people were hoping to cash in on it. So certainly this long engagement with Western art and patronage of contemporary artists is one context in which Warhol's paintings of Iranian royalty gained some meaning. The first appearance of Warhol's work in Iran probably came at the 1972 Shiraz Festival, when Merce Cunningham staged Rainforest, his 1968 piece that incorporated Warhol's silver aluminum pillows. In this context, it's important to think about Warhol's work commissioned by the royal family as part of a broader pattern of patronage by which a significant slice of the New York avant-garde received funding and international exposure. And the timing was apt because early in 1970, so a few years before Warhol made his trip, Nixon, in an attempt to counter inflation that was resulting from the conflict in Vietnam, had sort of seriously gutted American government financing for the arts, which left a gap that was filled somewhat unevenly by Japanese investors to some degree, but then most spectacularly and suddenly by the Iranian government. And whether you accept Robert Hughes's line that this funding was simply a form of soft power diplomacy, or the former Empress's own claims that she just was aiming to bolster her country's arts community by exposing artists to the outside world and vice versa, it's at least interesting to note that the Warhol commissions mark a shift in traditional approaches to state portraiture, in that they promise their sitters, the royalty themselves, inclusion in an international collection of celebrities and media figures, everybody else that Warhol was making portraits of. It's kind of the international jet set. Rather than what state portraiture normally does, which is confirm distinction upon an artist by virtue of granting him exclusive access to the monarch. So to put this another way, what's happening here is a conflation of state portraiture and social portraiture. These two things have been completely conflated at this moment and in this situation. So from Warhol's point of view, state patronage offered a special kind of financial promise. Unlike clients who might buy one or two portraits, or if he could convince Holly Solomon's husband to buy a dozen of them or something, a government, and especially one that was invested in propagandistic iconography, might buy dozens of paintings and place them in government buildings and banks and other public sites. And this is sort of what he was hoping for. It's worth noting that Warhol also, though unsuccessfully in this period, was pursuing Imelda Marcos as a client. He was hoping to get her. And by the time he landed these commissions in Iran, he had already completed portraits of the German Chancellor Willy Brandt and Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. Let's see. Later on, he would get commissioned to paint Gerald Ford and President Jimmy Carter. So he sort of was making this political portraiture part of his business at this moment. Not all of the political portraiture was commercial. I mean, a lot of it was, but some of it actually had political content. So he had done a portrait of Richard Nixon, for instance, that ended up, he donated this painting to the McGovern campaign, and it actually ended up backfiring on him. At least according to one version of the story, Nixon sicked the IRS on him as a result of this, which had the sort of fortunate effect of resulting in the Andy Warhol diaries. And the way that happened is that in order to keep track of his spending, he would call his secretary, starting in 1976, unfortunately right after he went on this trip to Iran, he started calling his secretary, Pat Hackett, every morning and then telling her what he did the day before by recounting it by receipt. So if you've read the Andy Warhol diaries, you know that they're not actually things that he wrote. They're transcripts of phone calls that she has culled from her notes and then rewritten them in his voice. But they're full of things like, we went downtown and had lunch at 1 Fifth Avenue, and I saw Patti Smith there, $1.52 cab ride. That's sort of, he's kind of keeping track of his receipts in case the IRS is going to come after you. So you can think about this as another version of political portraiture that's maybe not quite commercially motivated. Most people don't think of it, however, but politics had been a feature of Warhol's work all along. So some of his earliest paintings to deal with American politics involved JFK and especially his grieving widow. Even though the paintings that we know as the death and disaster paintings, which included this one of race riots in the United States, didn't have as much attention in the United States as they did in Germany or Paris. There is more sign of Warhol's awareness of social unrest in the 1960s than he's often given credit for. So it's worth, I think, considering that politics had been something that was always sort of on his radar. But beginning in the early 1970s, he seemed to take a special interest in the relationship between political propaganda, iconography, mass media, and commerce. You can think about the Mao portraits as coming out of that nexus of concerns. On Bob Colacello's account, this interest is fairly easy to explain. Political figures were like any other stars. They were often rich. They commanded publicity. They exercised social power. And they usually had the funds and the egotism to commission portraits by which their faces would become recognizable to mass audiences. So they're not that different, say, than, on one hand, the other famous Farah that he painted in the 1970s is Farah Fawcett, right? I mean, so there's something of a continuum that exists here. Just bring it back. I think, now I can, here we go. Forward, harder, and now I'm back on track. So Warhol's introduction to the royal family had been brokered by the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, Feridun Hoveyda, who had transformed the embassy in New York into a major center for New York high society, with art and film stars at the center of his regular guest list. So Hoveyda's brother was the prime minister of Iran. Hoveyda had been an influential film critic in Paris in the 1960s, a fan of Andy Warhol as a filmmaker. He was also a painter and an art collector in his own right. References to his parties at the embassy or at his apartment riddled the society pages in New York through the 70s. So he was a major topic of conversation, who was at the embassy parties and who was seen with whom. These parties also form a really important part of the subplot of Bob Colacello's memoir of this decade, which is called Holy Terror, and is one of the primary sources for our understanding of this aspect of Warhol's career. Colacello estimates that Warhol's crew attended at least one dinner party a month at the embassy or the townhouse, which they dubbed the Caviar Club. And Robert Hughes would later describe the Warhol crowd as circling him derisively, as circling around the consulate's caviar tub like pigeons around a bird bath. Hoveyda's parties, and these were sort of echoed by equally lavish high publicity affairs in Washington, D.C. that were thrown by the ambassador there, Ardeshir Zahedi, who was Elizabeth Taylor's boyfriend briefly in the mid-70s, and was also the Shah's former son-in-law. So these parties in New York and D.C. were significant not only to cultural relations between Iran and the West, but also became for Warhol a platform for his public performance as a partygoer, which is one of his chief artworks of the 1970s, actually his appearance at parties. And it's something that received an extraordinary amount of commentary as well. The critic Isabel Bra has really persuasively demonstrated that Warhol was a sort of a harbinger of this post-Fordist mentality by which work and identity are completely fused in our own era, right? That Warhol sort of anticipated the way that we were always going to be at work forever. Even while you're here, you're at work, you just didn't even know it. But Warhol referred to this kind of party going as social work. I mean, that was his term for it. He really considered that going to these parties was part of his business, and it was quite literally because it allowed him and his employees to try to solicit clients for the portrait business. They would go to these parties, and what they were supposed to do is find people for him to paint so that they could make enough money to do the other kinds of things that Warhol liked to do. So in the New York Times, there was a lifestyle piece in 1977 that called these parties with a purpose. The author reassured his audience that parties that are given for a purpose may be fun, but the critical question is whether or not you read about them in the newspapers. And Colacello notes that one of Warhol's favorite activities in this period was to read about himself in the newspaper the next morning. So he really loved to pick up the paper and see if he was mentioned for some part of the night before. The Times piece also describes Warhol's presence at a party thrown for the Hoveydas in New York and at one thrown in his honor at the Iranian embassy in D.C. So the newspaper is already picking up on his on the connection that I'm talking about tonight. So since Warhol cannot leave his house without attracting a photographer, this writer explains, he become an invaluable person to the party givers. But party goers, including Warhol, wanted something in return. At a 1977 dinner in New York for the Princess Ashraf with a guest list that included Miloš Forman, Elia Kazan, Lester Persky, Elliot Kastner, others, Andy leaned in close and whispered to Bob, "They're all hoping the Iranians will finance their movies, right?" And of course, so was he. Warhol's first state dinner in DC, which was thrown by the Fords for the Shah and Empress, was also reported in the New York Times. Like New York's parties with a purpose, state dinners in DC were political events, and the politics were revealed in the guest list as much as in the entertainment. In a piece that was critical of the Fords' lowbrow taste as entertainers, the piece really savages the Fords, like not able to throw a very good party. The piece mentions Warhol's presence at this dinner for the Shah, but views it as an attempt by a non-elected president to enhance his popularity by inviting to dinner all sorts of people who never made it through the gates under Nixon. Entertainment for the evening included a scantily clad Anne Margaret, which one of Ford's aides confirmed was the president's attempt at a sexy show to appeal to the Shah's taste for pretty girls. This is part of this article. Later that evening, Pearl Bailey and Dionne Warwick, who were also on the guest list, gave an impromptu performance. And Colacello, who was waiting all the while in a DC hotel room, he didn't actually make it to the party, recounts the evening as told to him by a breathless Warhol. The Empress followed him from room to room. She kept trying to talk to him, and Warhol kept trying to escape because he was afraid she was going to ask him to dance. It turns out that this was a really successful evening, however. So the following summer, Warhol, along with Colacello and Fred Hughes, spent several days in Tehran in order to take Polaroids of the Empress on which Warhol would base a series of portraits. Their trip was coordinated by Nima Farahpahlavi, who took them to see her mother, who was Warhol's old collaborator, Munir, and also her stepfather, the oil dealer, Abel Farahpahlavi, who was a descendant of the Persian Khmer dynasty that had preceded the Pahlavis. Nima was also a cousin of the Zahedis, the ambassador, and though Colacello doesn't mention it, Munir writes in her memoir that Warhol's reputation had preceded him to the point that TV crews turned up at a dinner party that she threw for him. And then I think this was something that came out around the time of the Asia Society show. Colacello does now recall that young Iranians apparently kept asking if Andy could get them into Studio 54 when they were planning to come to New York in the fall. Whether or not Andy could get you into Studio 54 was half the reason anybody ever wanted to talk to him. I think. Colacello's account of this trip emphasizes what he perceived as Tehran's uneven modernity, manifest in its class distinction and partial westernization. He thought it was a little too Beverly Hills. He wanted it to be more exotic. And it was punctuated by a kind of disappointment when it turns out to resemble California a little too much. They all seemed more American or European than Middle Eastern, he writes in his memoir, and they all preferred talking about the couture houses of Paris or the discos of New York rather than about oil prices or human rights. So people hate it when your audience doesn't behave the way that you think it should. Aside from the caviar and a visit to a discotheque that was rumored to be owned by the Shah's sister, Ashraf, Warhol in Colacello's account was most wowed by the crown jewels and the peacock throne. But the trip yielded the needed Polaroids, and on his return, Warhol completed a series of portraits in muted colors that once they had received Ambassador Haveda's approval, made their way back to Tehran. According to Colacello, the Empress ordered 8 portraits for the palace, 2 more for the main office of Iran Air and the National Bank of Iran, and another 2 for the embassies in New York and Washington, 12 in all for a total fee of $190,000. It was Colacello's first big commission, and he later wrote, Andy's dream of the perpetually multiplying portrait seemed to be coming true. There's something to be said, well, hold on for a second until I characterize these portraits a little further. In Colacello's narrative, there's always an eye on the revolution around the corner. When they first receive news that the Empress wants Warhol to paint her portrait, Andy whispers to Bob, let's go right away and do it before something happens. In Tehran, he writes, they never heard the word Shiite, and these are details that Colacello brings up every time he tells the story. It's a set piece at this point. These details are repeated over and over. They never heard the word Shiite, but when they visited a bazaar in an older part of town, the one place where young women were wearing all-concealing chadors, they received hisses from 2 or 3 dark and ominous faces. In the summer of '77, when they attended a ceremony in New York honoring the Empress's human rights work, A mob of protesters greeted them outside, screaming, "Kill the Shah." And Warhol, who had just received Farah's compliments on her portrait, says to Colacello, "Now's the time to pop the question about the Shah's portrait to Hoveyda. Then there's the 3 kids, Bob. You could be on Easy Street, but you better hurry. You heard them yelling out there." And it turns out that "you could be on Easy Street, but you better hurry" is a recurring theme in Colacello's account of the Warhol 70s as a whole. It's sort of like, hurry up, you've only got a few moments left. The economic recession that followed on the heels of the oil crisis is, of course, what has Warhol like the rest of the guests at Hoveyda's parties hoping to find Iranian patrons. But the restlessness stemmed from the sense that the revolution was looming ever closer, at least in the narrative. Right? The narrative already knows what's coming around the corner, so he's obviously building up to something that at the time they didn't realize would come to quite the climax that it did. The self-consciousness here about the ticking of the clock is partly a market prognostication. He's mindful of the financial realities of the art world in the midst of recession. Years later, Colacello would tell a UK newspaper, "I learned working for Andy that there isn't really the separation people think there is between society, the art world, and the corporate elite, and the European aristocracy. As you go higher up the social scale, they all kind of merge. But in the 1970s, this merger seemed like it was splitting apart at the seams." The rest of the story unfolds in Colacello's account and in the Andy Warhol diaries both, as the dynasty is crumbling around Warhol and the monarchy. In addition to sounding out Hoveyda on the Shah, Warhol was eagerly pursuing the Princess Ashraf's portrait. At a New York party in her honor in the fall of '77, Hoveyda encouraged Warhol to snap Polaroids of the princess on the spot, to sort of like, get these pictures now so we can get the paintings underway. Sort of indicative of the growing sense of urgency and uncertainty they're all beginning to feel. The princess ate a lot, Warhol told Pat Hackett the next morning during their phone call. But the queen, when she was there, didn't eat much at all, maybe because she was afraid of poisonings, although the food is pre-tasted. And that's Warhol's account. Hoveyda stepped up his socializing, trying to keep up appearances as the political situation was becoming more heated. At least that was the perception that Warhol's friends had. But the caviar sometimes seemed smaller and occasionally went around the table only once. And it's another feature of these accounts of how many times did the caviar go around the table, etc. In Washington, ambassadors had stopped serving caviar altogether, concerned that the Carter administration would find it ostentatious. But in fact, the Carter administration was disappointed when they would show up and there was no caviar. Even at parties thrown by the non-Iranians, the caviar supply seemed to be a bellwether of political realities. Warhol was suspicious, for instance, of the copious amounts that was served by Halston at a dinner party he attended in early 1979, a few months after the Shah had gone into exile. I don't know if it's really caviar these days, though, because with all the trouble around, where can they be getting it? They may just be making it up. The final year before the revolution forced the Shah to flee, American antagonism toward the monarch's authoritarian rule and human rights abuses spilled over into Warhol's sphere on a regular basis. It seemed clear that his relationship with the royals could taint him. In November of '77, a week after the Princess Ashraf's Polaroids had been taken and in advance of a visit to the U.S. by the Shah, the Village Voice blasted Warhol and other society types for their relationship with the Iranian government. The Village Voice blasted Warhol and other society types, Liz Taylor, Eliza Minnelli, and the Kissingers, for their relationship with the Iranians. Warhol and the Empress were shown together in the cover photo, standing in front of his portraits of her. The headline read, "Beautiful Butchers, the Shah serves up caviar and torture," and beneath the photos, the caption reads, "Empress of Iran and Andy Warhol, wire whips seem very far away." Even during the summer just passed, when the photograph of the Empress had been taken at an event in her honor, the atmosphere hadn't seemed quite so tense, right? "I posed for pictures with the Queen in front of my portrait of her," Warhol writes about this moment, or he tells his secretary, as it appears in the diary. "She said she was jealous of Hoveyda because he had 8 Warhols and she only had 4. The Queen is taller than me," he said. Maybe he's standing on a stool, I'm not sure. But now his relationship with the royalty was garnering speculations about his own politics. Once again, Warhol was invited to attend a state dinner for the Shah, this time in the Carter White House. 8,000 protesters stormed the streets outside, and Carter, the Shah, and Empress were inadvertently tear-gassed on the White House lawn when the police tried to disperse the protesters. And the Empress had such a great sense of humor about this event. She says to Interview magazine, I was a little bit amused, really, by the tear gas. It was my first experience. And so I think, kind of a funny moment. By the time Warhol finally received a green light to do the Shah's portrait, the political situation made it impossible for him to take his own photos on which to base the painting. There was no chance that he was going to photograph the Shah himself. So instead, Colacello worked with Hoveyda to create a selection of official press photos curated by the embassy, and then he took some of them to the factory for Andy's consideration. And they settled on what he called an elegant military photo. Warhol was a little worried that the photos all made the Shah a bit too scary looking. He wasn't sure how he's going to work with this material. I guess I can make him look good, but it's not going to be easy. He warned his assistant not to make the negative too dark. In February of '78, out to dinner with the Hoveydas at a restaurant where John Lennon and Yoko Ono and Calvin Klein were all also eating that night, he notes, the ambassador and his wife warned Warhol to go easy on the eyeshadow and lipstick when he painted the Shah. Fully cognizant of Warhol's preoccupation with cosmetics and especially drag, they said, keep it casual but conservative. As he had in the portrait of the Empress, Warhol aimed to paint the Shah as a modern monarch. But it was a little harder than he imagined. For most of 1978, Colacello writes, the walls of the factory's main room were lined with Andy's hurriedly completed portraits of the Shah in stately tones of blue and gray, and of Princess Ashraf in more feminine but equally restrained shades of peach and lilac. We were waiting for the checks before shipping them to Tehran, and we waited for a long time. Warhol's entourage was scheduled to make a return trip in the fall of '78 for the Shiraz Arts Festival, where the portraits of the royal family would go on exhibit. They also hoped to score a sitting with the Crown Prince, but word came in August that the festival had been canceled due to threats from extreme xenophobic groups, as Colacello reported, and the festival would never be held again. The previous year's festival had been marred by a growing number of American artists, including some who had visited in the past, who were now boycotting on humanitarian or political grounds. Warhol noted to Pat Hackett that he was so relieved by the cancellation, but question of payment remained. What are we going to do with all these portraits of the Shah and his sister we haven't been paid for, he asked Bob. You better call Hoveyda and get a check quick. When they heard the Princess Ashraf was secretly in town later that fall, they encouraged her to come see the portraits. By then, the revolutionaries had forbidden the Shah's family from doing business with the government, the result of their belief that Ashraf in particular enjoyed too much financial and political influence. There was talk of the royals being stripped of their titles, and Warhol was hoping that they wouldn't be stripped of their money as well. At least not until he got paid. The princess arrived at the factory accompanied by U.S. Secret Service. Warhol had, at her request, cleared his calendar of all other appointments and deliveries. He noted her designer clothing and jewels, but called special attention to her physical appearance, convinced she looked even younger than she had a year before. Warhol leaned in and whispered to Bob, she must have had a facelift, right? The princess and her twin brother, the Shah, were born in 1919, or roughly a decade older than Warhol, making her about 60, not quite 60 years old in this moment. Warhol not quite 50, I'm doing my math. Yes. According to Colacello, the princess thought that the likenesses of herself were nice enough, but she really became excited when she saw the triple portrait of her brother. She and her companions left without finalizing the details about the payment, but promised to invite Warhol to dinner. She didn't, and when communication between government officers in Iran and New York were cut off in November, Warhol declined to press Hoveyda further about payment. Though Fred Hughes said they were paid, this is one of Andy's employees, said that they were paid for the Empresses and Ashraf's portraits. Colacello claimed that the portraits of the princess and the Shah were never paid for, causing Warhol to take a $95,000 hit on the whole, and the market for them was suddenly limited. In April of 1979, a few months after the Shah had been driven from the country, the former Prime Minister, Ambassador Hoveyda's brother, was executed as an enemy of the revolution. Warhol attended a memorial service for him in New York, and he saw his friend Hoveyda again the following month when the former ambassador opened a show of his own paintings at the Bodley Gallery. In November, only a few weeks after student activists took 52 Americans hostage during the embassy in Tehran. Warhol's Portraits of the 1970s show opened at the Whitney. And the Iranian commissions were conspicuously absent from that show. So these portraits had been done, but they actually weren't included. They're not in the catalog. They weren't included in the show. So now what I want to do just for a few minutes is consider what these missing portraits can tell us. So I want to spend some time thinking about them in some detail. What can these missing portraits, the portraits that weren't part of the portraits of the 70s, what can they tell us that we don't already know about Warhol's years as a court painter to the 1970s jet set? Or what can they tell us about his work in general? Or what can they tell us about this moment in the 1970s when oil and art seemed to come together, and revolutionary politics? In many ways, these paintings function the same way that any other Warhol portraits do. One way to think about them is Robert Rosenblum's, who's who wrote the catalog for the Portrait of the 70s show. His assertion is that they offer a key social document to understanding the decade. Robert Hughes, the Warhol hater, on the other hand, in his scathing review of the Whitney show, wrote that rather than reviving the society portrait as a form, Warhol had zipped it into a Halston, painted its eyelids, and propped it up in the back of a limo where it moves but cannot speak. So, this is actually where I want to come back to these quickly and look at them in a little bit more detail. You can see how the Polaroid appears and then how the image has been turned into the screen print in multiples. One of the things that I've come to think about these paintings is that there's some continuity between them and some of Warhol's earliest celebrity portraits, right? Even in the pose almost here, but also in the application of the cosmetics, or the emphasis on the cosmetics. You can sort of see some similarities that may emerge there between the Empress and Liz Taylor. But then if we come, let's see if I can do this without, we come back here, okay. You start to see something else that goes on in Warhol portraits, especially in the 70s. And that's that there's an emphasis in his work on a kind of idealization of the subject, not just getting a likeness of what this person looks like, but capturing something about the fantasy of what they wish they looked like, or what he imagines that they wish they might look like. And it's a process that sometimes among critics elicits comparisons to cosmetic surgery. So Warhol subjects often look younger than the Polaroids would have them look here. And this comparison between his portrait style and cosmetic surgery is something that Colacello actually mentions in his account of watching Warhol at work. He writes, "I saw him crouched on the floor over a 40 by 40 inch negative, the standard portrait-sized blow-up of the negative the Polaroid that every portrait started with. The negative would then be converted into a silkscreen, which was then used to print the image onto a final portrait canvas. Various steps of the process were done by hands other than Andy's, but only Andy in all the years I ever knew him worked on the negatives. What Andy did to the negative was more like plastic surgery. He simply took scissors and snipped out the double chins, bumps in the noses, bags under the eyes. God, I said, as I watched him attack a whole neck and scissor away 70 years of wrinkles, is that how you do it?" Sort of his account. But it seems no coincidence then that Warhol was obsessed with what he took to be evidence of Ashraf's actual plastic surgery. Remember when she showed up, that was what he was obsessed with, that she looked even younger than she had when he took her picture the year before. If you view the silkscreen side by side with the Polaroid, it's clear that in this case he's actually succeeded in snipping away some years, leaving the impression that the princess is actually the same age as the empress. I mean, it's kind of hard to distinguish them. Or I think there's also something in the particular pose that he uses here that invokes his other great muse of the 1970s, Bianca Jagger. There's a little bit of that resemblance going on. Some of the detailing of the jewelry A little bit of the conservativeness of this portrait, I think, may also harken back to one of the Jackie portraits. The Shah, by contrast, recalls those sitters for Warhol screen tests in the 1960s, where they would sit in front of the camera and and kind of in an unblinking way, sort of let the camera have its effect on them. He seems to be staring down whoever it is that's taking the photograph that this was based on. The eyes and the eyebrows remain dark, almost a pitch black, with a hint of gray shadow around the edge, conveying a trace of human emotion. The hairline is a gray underpainting that directly contrasts the peach of the skin tone. It feels slightly artificial, and it almost seems, the way that that hairline is drawn, like a Hollywood vampire or something. And in contrast to the other portraits, the Shah's lavishes more attention on the costume than on the man wearing it. So it's really the costume itself that seems to have received the greatest attention here. The artist Michael Stevenson notes the appropriateness of this decision to use a photo of the Shah in military regalia. He had been known for his garish military costumes or for various extravaganzas, parades, lavish celebrations. Sort of one that he held earlier in the 1970s to mark the 2500th anniversary of Cyrus the Great, and sort of this enormous, an enormously publicized party that he threw at Persepolis. The colors in this portrait are also fairly conservative and restrained. If you think about this in contrast to portraits of Mick Jagger, for instance, from the same period, you can see that he actually has toned down the makeup as he was requested. The Shah doesn't quite appear to be in drag here, the way that a lot of Warhol subjects in the 70s, including Jimmy Carter, appeared to be. The subject here seems to view the viewer with a sort of steely resolve, and when Warhol produced these portraits in 1978, the Shah had known for at least 4 years that he was suffering from a form of leukemia, but for now that was still a well-guarded secret. So if you spend time in the literature about Warhol's portraiture, one of the things that you see is that there's a neat division, according to a lot of critics, between his work in the 1960s, which seems to have been more rigorously conceptual and maybe more groundbreaking and influential, and then the kind of unabashedly commercial, what he called business art of the 1970s. But more recently, critics are starting to emphasize continuities across the full 25-year career. The 70s portraits, like the early work, speak to the transformation of the subject into a commodity, and a branded one at that. When Warhol painted you, you became a Warhol, in other words. And you stood to gain fame and immortality as such, apart from whatever else it was that was making you famous. Warhol didn't just chase stars famously, he made them. He held out to his potential customers an assurance of their immortality as museum pieces or collector's items. In this way, the political portraiture exemplifies a long Warholian consideration, participation in, and critique of celebrity culture. And part of the critique is rooted in the means of production. As Jonathan Flatley, who's actually teaching at NYU this semester, has pointed out, these are silkscreen paintings of photographs. It's a painting of a photograph, right? Rather than portraits that are done from real life. There's no process by which Andy sits with his subject and then tries to capture the real life. He's actually trying to capture a pose, or trying to capture one medium in another. These are portraits that are about ambition and power, the reasons why people seek, and they're about the reasons people seek to have their portraits done in the first place, which means they're also about mortality. Warhol's portraits always tend to trouble easy oppositions, such as representation and reality, though, between performance and authenticity, or between life and art. They force us to ask, in what ways are photographs, or poses, or ambitions, or desires not part of real life? Are cosmetics real or not? What about the consumer promise of a new identity provided by beauty aids or cosmetic surgery? When you get plastic surgery done, is that real or not? You're going to live with it the rest of your life. It sounds pretty real. This is a line of inquiry that's a subject of Warhol's work from the very beginning of his career, and it stretches through this period and into the last decade of his life as well. Warhol's work reminds us that we're surrounded by images, we shape ourselves according to them, and that our lives are changed and transformed by them. We're led on by the belief that we can join the collection of famous subjects if the right moment or the right audience or the right producer comes along. If we get invited to the right party, if we work the right connection, if we continually work on ourselves. The fantasy of celebrity culture, which Warhol tapped so well, often ignores what his portraits actually emphasize. The realities of the authentic experience of cosmetics and commodification. Even less frequently can we admit that it's easiest to join this world of celebrity if you have the money to buy your way in, although this is probably the principal lesson that Warhol's portrait business should teach. So to return in conclusion to these portraits in particular, I want to use a quote that Dennis Hopper's wife, Brooke Hayward, gave about the process of being a Warhol subject. I just want to think about how her experience might be able to transfer to these and make some final observations about it. Brooke Hayward said, Andy conceived his portraits as idealized versions of his sitters. In my case, Andy always had this conceit that I should have been a movie star, which no doubt is why he chose of all the Polaroids the most glamorous pose and rendered it in classic Easter egg colors. It's a color palette that's similar to the one that he's using here. By using all those powerful colors, all reality is swept away. Jonathan Flatley reads this quote to argue that Warhol was interested in already made-up faces. He's interested in makeup, in fictional identities, in containers and signs of something else. He's interested in the same period he's painting these portraits in drag queens, in media figures, and political icons with some sort of equal curiosity about what they had in common. What is the something else that Warhol invokes in the case of this family? The key here may lie in the threat of reality being swept away. These are, after all, portraits of people whose public fictions, the entire world that they've constructed for decades, were unraveling in the very moment that Warhol documents them. Farah's vulnerable hunch, or Ashraf's cosmetically enhanced glamour, or the paleness, the whiteness even of the Shah in uniform against the unreality of an Easter egg pastel, these are signs not just of obviously fictional identities, but of a set of identities captured just in time, right before their expiration dates. And the expiration dates is something Warhol had been preoccupied with. In the 60s, he did a portrait of tuna cans that had expired, the contents of which poisoned a number of people. So he's concerned not just with Campbell soup cans, right? These are the promise of comfort in a can, but also about the deadly possibility that that kind of food could kill you as well. These are identities that have all but crushed the individuals who propped them up. These portraits invoke not just the Kennedys, but the whole fantasy of Camelot. And recall that at one point the Kennedys and the Pahlavis were media peers. A fantasy about a world before it fell apart. And this is perhaps the most consistent continuity these portraits establish with Warhol's larger project. These are death and disaster paintings in the end. Like the earliest silkscreen portraits of the just dead Marilyn or the president's grieving widow, these paintings know that all portraiture ultimately anticipates or derives from loss and our futile desires to stave off the moment when death sends us into permanent exile. That's really the end of the talk, but I have two postscripts that I think are kind of fun. One of them is this. If you go to dinner at Park Avenue and 53rd Street in Manhattan at a restaurant called Casa Libre, it's a Milanese restaurant, you'll see several dozen Warhol portraits from the 70s sort of offering diners a glimpse into the decade prior to the Reagan Revolution, mostly portraits of the 70s. The restaurant's owner, A.B. Rosen, is famous for throwing parties. He's been compared by the New York Times to Warhol, even though Warhol was more frequently a prominent guest than a host in parties in the 70s. Included among Rosen's collection of around 100 Warhol portraits, alongside figures you can see here like Dolly Parton and Aretha Franklin, are hanging like ghosts of pre-millennial Manhattan. portraits of Bob Colacello, and also the Shah, the Shah and the former Empress of Iran. You can see them on display there. One of the places that these paintings still exist. Another postscript comes with these prints, which have been sold recently at Art Dubai. They're prints that Warhol decided to make based on the same, based on the paintings, and he was hoping that he would be able to sell these prints to wealthy residents of Tehran so they could hang them in the foyers of their home. And he thought that was really, he was going to clean up. He noticed that everybody had a portrait of the Shah and the Empress in their home, and he thought that if he made these prints, he was going to be able to sell them for a bundle. And apparently they didn't actually get sold then, but now they go for about $150,000 a piece. And finally, in 2010, in Abu Dhabi at the Emirates Palace Hotel, the New York gallerist Tony Shafrazi, who had his own gallery in Tehran in the 1970s and been involved in the assembly of portions of the Contemporary Art Museum's collection, put his own version of these paintings on display and on sale. The way he hangs these paintings is kind of interesting. Unlike the other version of the three paintings together that I've shown you most often tonight, here the Shah's in the middle. There's a way in which the Princess Ashraf is perhaps elevated to a sort of equal participant in the triumvirate, maybe a cheeky nod to the rumors over the years that she in fact wielded as much power in the kingdom as her brother did. But there's another implication clear, especially when he shows these paintings in a place like Abu Dhabi. The portraits were commissioned by and memorialized not just royalty, but a dynasty that was temporarily enriched by oil, a commodity that will eventually run out. That seems to be why he's turning them into a memorial here with the vase of flowers on the floor. Fortunately for the Warhol Foundation and for Warhol's collectors, perhaps, and I think that this would have to include the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which still owns a substantial number of Warhol's paintings after all. The portraits have magically been transformed. They've magically transformed one marketable commodity into another that will possibly outlive the oil reserves themselves. At least that's what everybody's banking on. That's it for tonight.